In contemporary times, the possibility of a new Cold War between the United States and People's Republic of China has increasingly become a topic of discussion. In foreign policy circles, a certain point of conversation has been the notion that Washington's engagement with Beijing over the past few decades was flawed, given that any effort to establish common ground with China will need to confront the reality that there are numerous advocates of disengagement within Beijing itself. Recent events have further added to the strain in the relationship between the two nations. For instance, earlier this year, an alleged Chinese surveillance balloon was reportedly seen in the U.S. In addition, the People's Liberation Army of China flew 57 warplanes with 4 ships towards Taiwan, with 28 of those planes crossing the unofficial boundary of the Taiwan Strait. In response, the U.S. dispatched a destroyer through the Taiwan Strait to demonstrate its commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. Finally, the General Minahan's memo has also suggested the likelihood of an impending war between the U.S. and China in the near future. 5 notable times the U.S. and China almost went to war. The United States and China have had a complex and at times tense relationship. While they have managed to avoid direct military confrontation so far, there have been several incidents over the years that brought the two nations dangerously close to war. Here are 5 such incidents. The Korean War, 1950 through 1953. The Korean War was a significant armed conflict that occurred from 1950 to 1953 between North Korea, backed by China and the Soviet Union, and South Korea, backed by the United States and its allies. The war began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces invaded South Korea, leading to a fierce military confrontation that lasted for 3 years. One of the most notable aspects of the Korean War was the involvement of the United States and China, which almost led to a direct confrontation between the two superpowers. In October 1950, China sent its troops to North Korea, which significantly changed the course of the war. The United States and its allies responded by increasing their military presence in the region, including the deployment of the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait. As the conflict escalated, there were several instances where the United States and China almost went to war. One such incident occurred in November 1950 when U.S. forces, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, launched a surprise attack on North Korean forces near the Chinese border. This move provoked China, which responded by sending hundreds of thousands of troops into Korea, resulting in a protracted and bloody conflict. Another notable event during the Korean War was the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, which took place in November and December of 1950. The battle involved U.S. Marines, who were surrounded by Chinese forces and had to fight their way through freezing temperatures and harsh terrain to escape. The battle resulted in heavy casualties for both sides, but demonstrated the resilience and determination of the U.S. military. The Korean War ended in 1953 with an armistice that established a demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. However, the conflict left a lasting impact on the region and the world, particularly in terms of the Cold War tensions between the United States and China. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War, which refers to the fact that the conflict is often overshadowed by other wars, such as World War II and the Vietnam War. It is sometimes also referred to as the War of Attrition, highlighting the prolonged and bloody nature of the conflict. Next is the Taiwan Strait Crisis from 1954 to 1955. The Taiwan Strait Crisis was a significant event that occurred from 1954 to 1955 between the United States and China over the status of Taiwan. The conflict arose when the Chinese government, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, began shelling Taiwan, which had been under the control of the nationalist government since 1949. The crisis nearly led to a direct confrontation between the United States and China, with both sides deploying their military forces to the region. The conflict began on September 3, 1954, when China started bombarding the islands of Quemoy and Matsu, which were held by the nationalist government. The United States responded by sending its 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait to prevent China from attacking Taiwan directly. The United States also provided military assistance to the nationalist government, including weapons and training, to counter Chinese aggression. The crisis escalated when China began shelling the islands with artillery and sending troops to the mainland coast opposite Taiwan. The United States responded by increasing its military presence in the region, including the deployment of additional troops and the establishment of air and naval bases in Taiwan. The situation became tense, with both sides engaging in saber-rattling and in issuing threats of military action. One of the most notable events during the Taiwan Strait crisis was the Quemoy-Matsu crisis in January 1955. This crisis involved a massive Chinese artillery barrage against the islands of Quemoy and Matsu, which the United States responded to by dispatching a carrier task force to the region. The crisis lasted for several months, with both sides engaging in military maneuvers and brinkmanship. The Taiwan Strait crisis ended in March 1955 with a ceasefire, which established a temporary truce between the two sides. The crisis had a significant impact on the region and the world, particularly in terms of the Cold War tensions between the United States and China. The conflict highlighted the importance of Taiwan as a strategic location for the United States and the challenges it faced in defending its interest in the region. Next is the U-2 incident in 1960. The U-2 incident was a significant event that occurred in May 1960 involving a U-2 spy plane operated by the United States and its pilot, Francis Gary Powers. The incident nearly led to a direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, with China also becoming involved in the conflict. The U-2 spy plane was used by the United States to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union during the Cold War. On May 1, 1960, Francis Gary Powers was flying a U-2 plane over Soviet airspace when he was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The United States initially denied any involvement in the incident, but the Soviet Union produced evidence of the U.S. espionage activities. The U-2 incident led to a significant escalation of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union accused the United States of violating its sovereignty and demanding an apology, which the United States refused to provide. The situation became even more tense when the Soviet Union announced that it would put on trial Francis Gary Powers for espionage. The U-2 incident also involved China, which threatened to intervene in the conflict on behalf of the Soviet Union. China had been a longtime ally of the Soviet Union, and the two countries had signed a mutual defense treaty in 1950. China saw the U-2 incident as a provocation by the United States and called for a united front against U.S. imperialism. The situation became increasingly dangerous, and with the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a war of words and brinkmanship, the United States considered launching a military strike against the Soviet Union to rescue Francis Gary Powers, while the Soviet Union threatened to retaliate with a nuclear strike. The U-2 incident was eventually resolved through diplomatic means, with the United States apologizing for the espionage activities and the Soviet Union releasing Francis Gary Powers in exchange for a Soviet spy held by the United States. However, the incident had a significant impact on the Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and the relationship between the United States and China. Next is the South China Sea incidents between 2013 and 2016. The South China Sea incidents refer to a series of territorial disputes that occurred between China and its neighboring countries, such as the Philippines and Vietnam, over control of the South China Sea. The disputes primarily revolved around China's claim to the majority of the South China Sea, which is also claimed by other countries in the region. The tensions between China and its neighbors reached a boiling point in 2013 when China began constructing artificial islands in the South China Sea. The United States, which has been a longtime ally of the Philippines and other countries in the region, accused China of violating international law and began conducting freedom of navigation operations in the disputed waters. The United States' involvement in the disputes was seen by China as interference in its territorial affairs, leading to increased tensions between the two countries. China responded by increasing its military presence in the South China Sea and building military facilities on the artificial islands it had constructed. In 2016, tensions between the United States and China escalated when a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Laysan, sailed within 12 nautical miles of one of the disputed islands in the South China Sea. China responded by dispatching military vessels to intercept the U.S. ship, leading to a tense standoff between the two countries. The South China Sea incidents brought the United States and China close to direct military conflict, with both sides engaging in aggressive rhetoric and brinkmanship. The United States was determined to uphold the principle of freedom of navigation in international waters, while China was equally determined to defend its territorial claims in the South China Sea. The situation was further complicated by the fact that other countries in the region, such as the Philippines and Vietnam, were also involved in the disputes and had conflicting interests. The disputes also had significant economic implications, as the South China Sea is a major shipping route and a potential source of oil and gas reserves. Despite the escalating tensions, both the U.S. and China avoided direct military confrontations. The two countries engaged in diplomatic talks to resolve the disputes peacefully, and in 2017, they agreed to a framework for a code of conduct in the South China Sea. Next, the Hong Kong protests between 2019 and 2020. The Hong Kong protests were a series of mass demonstrations and civil unrest that occurred in Hong Kong between 2019 and 2020. The protests were sparked by a controversial extradition bill that would have allowed suspects to be extradited from Hong Kong to mainland China for trial, which many residents of Hong Kong saw as a threat to their autonomy and the rule of law. The protests quickly escalated and turned violent, with protesters clashing with police and vandalizing government buildings. The Chinese government responded by increasing its presence in Hong Kong and passing a national security law that critics argue further erodes Hong Kong's autonomy. The United States became involved in the protests due to its support for democracy and human rights. The U.S. government condemned the violence against peaceful protests and expressed concerns about China's increasing control over Hong Kong. In response, the U.S. passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which aimed to support pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong and hold Chinese officials accountable for human rights violations. The tensions between the U.S. and China over the Hong Kong protests escalated further when the U.S. accused China of interfering in the protests and accused Chinese officials of human rights abuses. China denied the accusations and accused the U.S. of meddling in its internal affairs. The U.S. also took steps to limit its economic ties with China, including imposing tariffs and sanctions on Chinese officials and companies. China responded by imposing its own tariffs and limiting imports from the U.S. The situation between the U.S. and China over the Hong Kong protests became increasingly fraught, with both countries accusing each other of aggression and interference. However, despite the tension, neither side took direct military action. In recent months, tensions between the United States and China have reached new heights, and both nations are ramping up preparations for a potential new Cold War. Despite their assertions that they do not want such a scenario, recent actions by both sides suggest otherwise. Chinese President Xi Jinping has urged his government to focus on greater self-reliance, particularly in science and technology, while the United States is pressuring its allies to shift their supply chains away from China and deny its access to advanced chips and other strategic goods. While the relationship between the U.S. and China has long been fraught with tension, it has deteriorated even further since President Joe Biden met with President Xi in November 2022 and promised to improve relations. The alleged Chinese spy balloon incident in the U.S. sparked national outrage and led to Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceling a planned trip to Beijing. Despite Biden's pledge to speak with Xi soon after the incident, the two leaders have not communicated since there is no indication of when they might do so. Adding to the strain, the Department of Energy and the FBI have both suggested that the COVID-19 pandemic may have originated from the lab leak in Wuhan, China. The U.S. has also recently imposed sanctions on 5 Chinese companies for allegedly supplying aerospace parts to Iran. Despite these incidents, both China and the U.S. are still searching for cooperation possibilities due to their interdependence. President Xi's more conciliatory approach could have a positive impact on the global economy and possibly even help end the war in Ukraine. While the People's Liberation Army remains aggressive regarding Taiwan, the importance of the economy to President Xi may make war less likely this year. Overall, while both nations have come close to direct military conflict in the past, they have generally been able to avoid it through diplomacy and negotiation. Nevertheless, the U.S.-China relationship remains complex and contentious, and it remains to be seen how it will develop in the coming months and years.